That's a great story, too.
It's great. And I think my 5-year-old nephew would like that. I have a question for you, Sean. The idea of what you've shared with us tonight are these vibrant stories full of imagery and personification. I'm wondering, a lot of families come into my office and their family stories, sometimes they're good, but sometimes they're saturated with problems, and they're wondering how to talk to their children and share kind of family-based reality stories versus fiction. How do you talk to people about how to make a family story come alive, even if it has some sad or negative parts?
I think there's several responses that I have in my brain to that question. The first one is, one of the reasons that in this first Daddy Teller book that I started with world folk tales, what have you. There's 8 in the book. There's 9 when people join the website. I started with these stories because I wanted to give people stuff that didn't carry so much emotional baggage. And when we have these profound things that have happened in our families, sometimes we first need to open the door to being receptive to story by some of these other non-threatening pieces. And then as we move on, we can start to grab some of these family stories. As a matter of fact, the second book is going to be called How to Talk to Your Adolescents Without Them Rolling Their Eyes at You. And so we're going to be able to teaching people how to carry these stories. I think, like all stories, we have to learn to distill down the most important parts. And your 8-year-old is not ready to hear the complete story of what happened to Grandpa at 8. But he will eventually be ready for that story at 15. And so we break stories down into their base components. For example, I was raised with a dad who loves German Shepherds, just really loved German Shepherds, raised them in kennels and everything.
Tell you what, before we hear the story of the German Shepherds, let me do a bit of station business, and I want to hear how we do this. By the way, what Sean is teaching us is also important for grandparents to bond with their grandchildren. I mean, this is just crucial. You'll long be remembered for that than when you were preaching to your little one. We'll be right back.
Okay.
Nice to have you with us. And we're talking to Sean Bavala. And by the way, again, his website is daddyteller.com. And he has lots of neat stuff up on his website. And I started to say right before that break, we were talking about for grandparents to bond with their grandchildren. This is one of the ways. And you were responding to Dr. Karam's question as well.
Well, I think Dr. Karam had a great comment, and I know that from my own life, family stories have revealed truths about my parents that I knew more about as I got older, and where my dad's compassion and energy and enthusiasm for animals came from. For example, from a story of one of his dogs dying. And I think Dr. Karam is exactly right that we do have to talk about some of these family history, family issues. In pop psychology, we say baggage, but these things are out there that need to be opened. But I think they need to be opened in stages, and we need to learn that not all of our story is always told at the same time. Yeah, that's right. And I think one of the reasons I love working with families this past 10 years or so is the transformative power of telling stories, where a story can start as kind of problem focused and having a lot of bad parts, but inside, through working with families, you find the strength of not only those family members but of the story. So you kind of narrate a different ending, or it's a real live story that it can change in response to positive developments within the individual or the family's life. So it's important to have that ability, though, to use humor too. I think some of my best experiences in the stories you told tonight too, having humor, families being able to laugh together when telling stories seems so important to me. How important is humor when you're doing your storytelling? I think that for dads, that's one of our main roles in our family, is laughing. We're jungle gyms to our children, aren't we? When dad gets on the floor, it's time to wrestle. Right. And I have 4 daughters, and it was the same thing whether they were daughters or sons. It was time to wrestle. So I think that part of our role is to do that. there is an important place for humor. I think, though, as people pursue through the Daddy Teller book, I think about Chapter 8, for example, the story called The Stag at the Pool. And there's several different ways to end that story, depending on what you think your children need to hear at the time. And some of them's funny, some of them's cute, but sometimes we have to put that ending in there that says things didn't work out the way they wanted them to work out.
Well, I think of what happens at an Irish wake, or when someone we love has passed away. And typically, and this is true in every religion, typically what happens is the family gets together, and inevitably it turns to funny things that the person did in their life, or a beautiful moment that the person touched their life, and we tell stories. I mean, that's what we do.
That's how people continue to live. Not only do our values live through story, but people continue to live in our memory through their stories. Remembering when my grandfather died, that one of my biggest memories of him was him feeding potato chips to my firstborn daughter, and her reaction to how he did that. Those kind of things keep him alive in my mind, and stories keep values, ideas, and people alive.
And of course, there's a lot of vocabulary and literacy skills that are taught in stories.
There are. When we start to, especially when we start to have children tell stories back to us, things like sequencing, how things take place. In the truth and story that I told you, things need to take place in some type of order. Now, I've been telling that story for 25 years, and I tell it a little differently every time I tell it. However, there needs to be an order to that. If I start by saying, and then story came along and started to put truth on story, but then we found story outside the city naked, you can't do that. So even the idea of sequencing is a basic math and reading skill that's painlessly taught in storytelling.
If you, many parents come to me and they want to know how to talk to their young son or daughter about a divorce or one of these major life transitions, death of a loved one, things Stan was talking about earlier. How do you help them develop themes or ways to kind of distance, to depersonalize the story, but also make it relevant through metaphor or through some literary device so the parents can understand, or the child can understand what the parents are getting to?
One of the things that I advise people is, I've got 8 stories in the book, but 8 stories is not enough. And so I advise people, when they really need to start telling a truth, and it needs to come slowly, to start looking at things like world folk tales, such as Aesop tales. Nearly anything you want to talk about, any form of human behavior, is somehow covered in the Aesop fables.
One way or the other.
That's exactly right. One way or the other, there's going to be a way to illustrate an idea that you have. And so the Internet has made it incredibly easy for all of its good and bad. One of the good things is it's made it very easy to start saying, I need to find stories that do that. Now, I do that as part of my coaching with people is work on them with their own story. But people can do this on their own as well. But just start digging. Start digging for something that illustrates the truth they want to talk about.
Well, again, one of the things that when you explain death to children, one of the best ways to do it with young children is through story. And that's always a very difficult thing. Rabbi Grollman has a number of stories that, as a way of relating death to children. And stories can be a bridge then for very difficult kinds of topics, can't they?
They can, and what we do in story is we allow something else to stand in as the metaphor. And unless they live in Arizona like I do, children know what the seasons are. they know what the seasons are, and the idea of the trees appearing to pass away, and on the other side of the darkness and the snow, there's new life. Those types of metaphors, older children especially, can start to grab. As soon as a child gets the ability to start thinking abstractly, which, I mean, you gentlemen certainly would probably have better data than I do, but it's usually around 9 or 10 years old. As soon as they start to get abstract thinking, it's easier to start applying these metaphors and saying, look, just because something stopped here doesn't mean on the other side there isn't something new, there isn't spring. And that's how we learn to use story.
I think it's true, and also it's their culture and certainly how they're taught in school was a nice parallel to this. So I think for parents to understand how their children are learning in school, or those main themes and stories that come out of their school life, and be able to follow through that at home and put their own twist on it is important too.
Now, there's a difference between storytelling and reading a story to a child, or having them read it with you, isn't there?
There is, and there are two different skill sets, and both of those have value. Reading a book to a child teaches a lot about words and the order of words, and how the written process gets translated into the oral. And I think you must continue to read books to your children. In no way am I advocating please throw out every storybook in your place. However, story is also portable. And not only can you use it for bedtime, but I think one of the videos we talk about on daddyteller.com, we talk about having stories ready to go. So when you're taking those long trips for you to talk story into the rear view mirror, or when you're waiting in line at the doctor's office or the restaurant, there's other chances to have more portability to the stories. When you tell stories, children learn to tell them back. And when they start telling them back, they're learning, they're demonstrating their knowledge. Beautiful.
All right, we're talking with Sean Bavala, and you might check out his website at daddyteller.com. I'm Dr. Stan Frager with Dr. Eli Karam. We're all here for you, WGTK.